I have been taupoliphalous for half of the time that I have been in the O.T.O. I've been a bishop for about 15 years, and I've been an O.T.O. initiate for about 30. And during that whole time, I've been actively interested in the history of Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica, and I have learned a few things that I'd like to share. So I want to thank Crux Ansata and the officers of the Oasis for hosting this presentation. And I'd like to go ahead and get down to business. However, before I get into the actual history of where Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica, or E.G.C, comes from and how it got here, I need to spend some time on what it is. And so a few definitions are in order. Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica is Latin for Gnostic Catholic Church. This specific phrase in Latin or English denotes a particular ecclesiastical rite or system of ceremony administered by O.T.O. O.T.O, of course, is the first of the great religious orders to accept the law of thelema as communicated by Aiwass to the great beast, Aleister Crowley. In our 21st century bylaws and official organizing documents, E.G.C is often characterized as the liturgical arm of O.T.O, which should not be taken to imply that there are no liturgical aspects to the other outer rite of O.T.O, the Masonic style degree system of Mysteria Mystica Maxima. A similar, even more significant error would be to view E.G.C as the quote-unquote religious part of O.T.O, because all the parts of O.T.O are religious. As far as American legal parlance is concerned, the entire O.T.O is a quote-unquote church. And coming from a position of academic religious studies, all the various aspects of O.T.O are suffused with religious functions and intent. So one of the earliest O.T.O references to E.G.C in official documents is in the 1912 Manifesto of the Order, which is preserved as Liber 52 in our documentary canon. And the manifesto supplies this long list of earlier esoteric bodies whose wisdom and knowledge is supposed to be concentrated in the order. And the first on the list is the Gnostic Catholic Church. So this mention clearly posits some relevant history prior to O.T.O, and I will be going into that at some length, but we're still not quite out of the woods on definitions. I want to take these three words, Gnostic Catholic Church or Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica, I'll take them in that order, one at a time, in order to help better explain what sort of thing we're talking about here. Now, starting with Ecclesia, there was briefly, and I hope it was brief, it's been a while since I encountered it, a rhetorical gambit with a purpose that is still unclear to me, according to which some Thelemites would insist that E.G.C was not a church. It was instead an ecclesia. And for our purposes, this is really a distinction without a difference. The rite being discussed tonight has carried the same basic name in 4 different languages: the French Église catholique gnostique, the German Gnostica Katholische Kirche, the English Gnostic Catholic Church, and the Latin Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica are all exactly the same thing and refer to the same single phenomenon. And in this context, church and ecclesia mutually translate one another. Now, there is an etymological difference. The Romance language French and its Latin ancestor get église or ecclesia from the Greek ecclesia, meaning assembly or gathering. Itself is a noun formed from a verb meaning to call or summon. Meanwhile, the English church comes from Kirche, or the German Kirche, which in turn comes from the Greek Kyriakon, meaning the house of the Lord, from Kyrios, Lord, a word that the priest often speaks in the Gnostic Mass, addressing Kyrie Abrasax, Kyrie Mithras, Kyrie Thale, and so forth. But for many centuries, people on both sides of the English Channel have understood church and Eglise to mean the same thing, and that thing is expressed in Latin as Ecclesia. Now, the word Gnostic is a much dicier term. There's no dispute that it comes from gnosis, a Greek word meaning knowledge. But the idea of Gnosticism is a highly contested one. There is a significant faction among scholars of religion who support basically abolishing the word because it's unhelpful in their view to designate any actual religious tendency because it is so enmeshed in polemics and heresiology. Even among those who use the term, there is wide disagreement about what qualifies as Gnostic. Most of these are concerned with ancient Gnosticism, religious schools outside of what became Christian orthodoxy in the early centuries of the Christian era. The ones who attempt to apply a concept of Gnosticism to modern culture, like critic Harold Bloom, are generally even less relevant to our concerns here. But there is little consensus on what the ancient Gnostics thought or did, or how much they identified with one another. And ideas about the ancient Gnostics have changed enormously since that Gnostic Catholic Church appeared in the 1912 Manifesto. For many centuries, the study of Gnosticism was exclusively heresiological. That is to say, it represented an examination of proscribed theologies, forbidden religious ideas, almost entirely transmitted through representations by their enemies, people like the 3rd century Christian bishop Hippolytus, who transmitted the light of the Gnosis to us, his successors and his heirs. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, there were the first glimmers of an archaeological study of these ancient heretical teachings. 3 ancient Coptic documents, one held in Berlin and 2 in London, became the basis for 19th century translations by C.W. King and G.R.S. Mead. This material was of enormous interest to theosophists and occultists. We have people like the early Golden Dawn adept Florence Farr, who included extracts from the Bruce Codex in her book Egyptian Magic. Aleister Crowley, in turn, quoted from this text by Farr, attributing the passage from the ancient Gnostic text to Jesus Christ in the epigrams he published for Contes en Pax in 1907. But most of the ancient Gnostic writings we now possess were not discovered until 1945 at Nag Hammadi, and these fueled the interest in Gnosticism among Jung and the Eranos Circle and other 20th century intellectuals, along with more recent notions about the ancient Gnostics. However, back at the turn of the 20th century, O.T.O. head Theodor Reuss referred to Gnostic neo-Christianity as a set of teachings comprehended by the order, which might make us question whether any sort of classical reconstruction was intended. Maybe Reuss meant to reference a persisting and developing gnosis, somewhat after the manner of the recent scholar Dan Merkur, who defines gnosis in terms of visionary practices, instead of seeking to circumscribe the historical phenomenon as a sort of myth-laden deviation from Christianity. In any case, there is a very particular use of Gnostic to which we can point. In the Creed of the Gnostic Mass, we refer to one Gnostic and Catholic Church. This wording parallels the Christian Nicene Creed, which says one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So in both cases, we see the term Catholic, but Apostolic is dropped in favor of Gnostic. Apostles are followers, and the Apostolic Church is one that follows Jesus. Gnostics, by contrast, are knowers, and a Gnostic church is one that is grounded in a particular knowledge. A Christian Gnostic church, for example, might be one grounded in what Jesus is supposed to have known. Finally, it is possible to see Gnostic as something of a trademark, one that indicates the ongoing relationship of the outer Gnostic church to the secret sanctuary of the Gnosis, which is the 9th degree of O.T.O, where that particular gnosis or knowledge is held, and also indicating a heritage from the Gnostic Church or the Ecclesia Gnostica of the 19th century. Finally, Catholic. In the United States, it has been customary to understand Catholic and Protestant as the chief division of Western Christianity. Of course, the Protestant-Catholic distinction is even more charged in England, a country that experienced the Protestant Reformation firsthand, and the consequent cultural and political upheavals. In English culture, Roman Catholicism is tinged with sorcery and a sense of the forbidden. You can imagine that in Aleister Crowley's upbringing among the ultra-Protestant Plymouth Brethren, that connotation was even stronger, if anything. But there were Catholics for many centuries before the Reformation. The term, as it appears in all the Christian creeds and statements of doctrine, means universal. In defining a religious body, it is the complementary opposite of ethnic. A little ironic in the US religious landscape when you consider that Catholicism in our pluralist setting is often identified with the ethnic character of immigrant enclaves. So we see references to Irish Catholics, Mexican Catholics, Polish Catholics, and so forth. There is actually a relevant sense in which the word Catholic became attached to our Gnostic Church because of a desire to express kinship with the Roman Catholic Church, and I'll get back to that in a bit. Now, alas, I have to talk a bit about apostolic succession. Keep in mind what I said a moment ago. In identifying ourselves as a Gnostic Church, empowered by the sanctuary of the Gnosis, we decline to call ourselves an apostolic church, empowered by following Jesus and his disciples. But because of its importance in the history of church rights generally, and even ours, it's important to understand some things about apostolic succession. So, what is it? It is a mechanism to legitimize sacramental authority in traditional Christianity. Just right there on my first bullet point. That's it. It is a tangible way of receiving and passing on the blessing that Jesus Christ of Nazareth was supposed to have given his immediate disciples. The principle and theory of the thing is that any bishop can transmit apostolic succession when ordaining clergy, including ordaining or consecrating another bishop, who can then pass it on as well. The core of the operation is an act of chirotonia, or laying on of hands. Now, there's ample reason for suspecting that this simple picture of the historical transmission of the blessing of Jesus has some flaws. Records suggest that many early Christian congregations elected their own bishops without recourse to external sources of ordination. And as far as Aleister Crowley was concerned, and I agree with him, true Christianity was the religion of John Barleycorn, and thus in no way dependent from any historical Jesus, whom Crowley derided as pseudo-Christ. Still, the magical power of the clergy and the church institution has had real effects through the device of apostolic succession. Some of the strangest of these are classed as the episcopi vagantes, or wandering bishops. There are all sorts of church rules and regulations intended to prevent the rogue consecration of bishops. If a Catholic bishop creates another bishop without proper authorization, not only will the Catholic Church refuse to recognize the ministry and authority of the new bishop, they automatically excommunicate him. But from a weird magical angle, he's still a bishop. You know, there's like no backsies. And the so-called wandering bishops who are created in this way have interacted with the various esoteric and fringe churches of recent centuries in various exchanges of authority and presumed magical or mystical power. In 1919, Crowley wrote to his disciple Charles Stansfeld Jones, "I am ordained priest and consecrated bishop and archbishop by the laying on of hands. Nothing else is valid." but he didn't indicate a specific apostolic succession, and in light of his other writings on Christianity, it is very doubtful whether he was interested in one. If his predecessor, Theodor Reuss, made him, quote, a magician and priest of the Holy One, as Crowley himself would later characterize the 9th degree of O.T.O., that was doubtless good enough for him. But the act of chirotonia was important, indispensable even. Now, before leaving my general notes on this topic of apostolic succession, I must quote from current O.T.O. policy. The traditional doctrines, theology, canon law, and insignia of the Roman Catholic Church, or Roman Catholic, Orthodox, and Jacobite churches do not operate within E.G.C. Now, having said all that, let's look at this. These two quote-unquote lines of succession are reproduced from an article published in the summer 1989 issue of an E.G.C. periodical, the Gnostic News. The one on the left shows the transmission of, through chirotonia, of authority from the Ecclesia Gnostica, or French Gnostic Church. This is the so-called Douanel succession, combining three autochthonous French churches, none of which had Roman Catholic apostolic succession for their ordinations. The one on the right, and SILENUS is the current father of the church, also known as HYMENAEUS Beta, right? So we have this simple 4-link chain to get from the founder of the Ecclesia Gnostica in France, Douanel, to, he isn't listed here, but I wonder why he's not listed here. I should add him to the slide. Anyway, Douanel proceeds uncos. He consecrated uncos, who consecrated Reuss, Crowley, McMurtry, and SILENUS. The second line of succession on the right is sometimes called the Antioch succession, and it is generally identified with its fathering Episcopus Vagans, Joseph René Villatte. And while there have been arguments as to whether some sort of wandering bishop's apostolic succession had become integrated earlier into the sanctuary of the Gnosis, it certainly did with HYMENAEUS Beta's ascension to the office of Patriarch. But he now characterizes his advertisement of this Antioch succession as a mistake. As early as 1991, he wrote, "Introducing my own apostolic succession was a misguided and unnecessary attempt to strengthen O.T.O. E.G.C's legitimacy. We don't give individual bishops the authority to consecrate other bishops. To quote the current E.G.C. manual, regardless of the putative validity of his or her apostolic succession, no person consecrated by any person other than a primate or the patriarch after October 1st, 1991, is recognized as a bishop of E.G.C. The so-called intrinsic succession passed through the sanctuary of the Gnosis is the Douanel or French Gnostic succession. So given that we don't or won't, or in some cases can't, use the Antioch succession, what should we care that we have it? Why would I bother to bring it up at all? Well, there have been periods when E.G.C. bishops cared about it very much, so it helps us understand that. And it's also a very interesting historical phenomenon. All right, look, I don't believe there was a historical Jesus. Or rather, and what comes to the same thing, there were plenty of historical Jesuses, but the one in the Bible is a matter of theological and literary invention, not empirical biography. And I don't covet his cooties, but the Roman Catholic apostolic succession doesn't necessarily have those cooties to provide anyhow. What we know it does have, and what it assuredly does connect us to, is figures like Roderick Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, church canon and Renaissance magus Marsilio Ficino, the monk and curate Francois Rabelais. And in antiquity, it may not go back to the first Christian communities, let alone to the historical Pinocchio, but it does incorporate entire Roman priesthoods forced by imperial edict to pivot from their previous pagan rites to a then new Christian institution. And this notion can be studied profitably in Alexander Hislop's The Two Babylons, where he treats it like it's a bad thing. All right, let's look briefly at this chart I put together about 25 years ago. It shows genealogical relationships, as I was then able to trace them, among the principal neo-Gnostic churches of the 19th and 20th centuries. E.G.C, way over on the right, is the only one here that is Thelemite, or even avowedly non-Christian, and it is represented as an offshoot of the French Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica, as it was called, or as it was called when E.G.C was derived from it, l'Église catholique gnostique. You can see two different arrows entering there. One of them, a little ways down on the left side, is from the Syrian Jacobite Orthodox Church, and that represents the Antioch succession from Vilat, but it entered the EGU after the split from E.G.C, so it's really irrelevant in terms of our heritage, only being sort of reinstalled with HYMENAEUS beta. And we really don't care anything about the whole left half of the chart for purposes of our own institutional history. The arrow from above, however, represents three original sources, which were the three French occult churches of the 1800s that I mentioned before. And to these, we now turn. In 1804, a Neo-Templar order was founded in France by Ledru de Chevillon de Satan and Raymond Fabre-Palaprat. Fabre-Palaprat claimed to be the heir to an independent apostolic succession of Saint John the Divine, author of the Fourth Gospel. And it was on this authority that he founded the Johannite Church, chiefly to serve as an ecclesiastical vehicle for this Templar revival. The Johannite Church used a variant version of the Fourth Gospel called the Evangelicon as its principal scripture. They claimed to have this in a 12th century copy of a 5th century manuscript. Neither the Johannite Church nor the Associated Templar Order appear to have survived Fabre-Palaprat's own death in 1838, but members of the Johannite clergy continued to exercise their ecclesiastic prerogatives as they saw them in other venues, and they did transmit the Johannite succession to later fringe churches. L'œuvre de la miséricorde, or the work of mercy, was created by Eugène Vintras in 1839 to proclaim visionary communications from the Archangel Michael, the Holy Ghost, Saint Joseph, and the Virgin Mary. In the visions, Vintras had been informed that he was the reincarnation of the Hebrew prophet Elijah, and that Charles Naundorf was the true king of France. After 4 years of evangelizing and 5 years of imprisonment, Vintras began the interior sanctuary of the Elie of Carmel, or the Elliot Church of Carmel. Although popular histories point to Vintras as a Satanist, his Christian theology appears to have actually been rather conventional, although his visionary claims to authority were radical. He engaged in charismatic practices, including magic with Eucharistic hosts he claimed to have consecrated and which were seen to bleed. Note that neither Vintras nor Fabre-Palaprat called their churches Gnostic. In 1890, Jules Donnel established the first modern Gnostic church, working in response to a vision he had experienced in 1888, which included his consecration as Bishop of Montsegur and Primate of the Albigenses at the hands of the Eon Jesus. During the intervening 2 years, Donnel labored over the preparatory researches, both through his work as a librarian and antiquary, and through a series of seances to contact Cathar and Gnostic spirits. A key collaborator in these efforts was the Theosophist Lady Caithness, who also supplied Donnel with ideas from the English mystic Anna Kingsford. and the resulting church was especially concerned to reestablish the divine feminine. Joannel claimed that the church's doctrines reflected ancient Gnosticism as expressed in the teachings of Valentinus, and the liturgical expression of the church was along Albigensian or Cathar lines. That is, it was a modified revival of the greatest medieval French heresy. Joannel's name as patriarch was Tau Valentin II, and it was in his church that the custom started of prefacing the names of bishops with a Tau. Now, one could do a whole talk on just the matter of this next slide. In the 1890s, the French esoteric world was rocked by scandals, and the occult churches were not immune. In fact, they were at the heart of it. Following the death of Ventra in 1875, the Ventrisian Church of Carmel had come under the control of the notorious Abbé Joseph Antoine Boulan. Boulan had been repeatedly disciplined in the Catholic Church and was credibly accused of various sorts of sexual misconduct. He alienated most of the existing membership of the Church of Carmel, and the remaining organization was then infiltrated by a couple of occultists from Paris, Stanislas de Goita and Oswald Wirth. And they turned on Boulan publicly, accusing him of having corrupted the church. Into this conflict wandered the novelist Jory-Karl Huysmans, who was more favorably impressed with Boulan than with Wirth and de Goita, and the benevolent Dr. Johannes character in Huysmans' 1891 novel Là-bas was modeled on Boulan, who claimed that he was under magical attack from Wirth and de Goita and their friends among the Martinists and the Kabbalistic Order of the Rose-Croix. This was a hugely popular novel by Huysmans, and so Là-bas only inflamed the tensions. And when Boulan died in 1893, Huysmans' friend, Jules Bois, suggested that he was a victim of magical assassination, not even needing to indicate who his enemies were. The 1890s in France featured one of the first ever cottage industry conspiracy theory shops, organized by someone who billed himself as Leo Taxil. He said that the Freemasons and the occult churches, and basically all non-Catholic religious bodies, were secretly controlled by something called the Order of the Palladium. This was a globe-spanning operation of devil-worshipping sex fiends. You know, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, if you'll pardon my French. Who should be persuaded by this propaganda offensive but Jules Joannel, founder and patriarch of l'Eglise Gnostique? Joannel resigned from his own church and converted to Catholicism. He even wrote articles for Taxil's effort and a book called Lucifer Unmasked under the pen name Jean Kotzka. 2 years later, Taxil, whose real name was Gabriel Jogan Paget, rented out a lecture hall for a public presentation. He sold tickets and filled the place with Catholic clergy and Freemasons alike, and then confessed to everyone there that there was no Palladian order, and that the whole thing had been a stunt. No one in the house was pleased, and he was lucky to escape uninjured. Now, I've read a lot of interesting accounts of this period and these controversies for a wide view, including details of the founding of l'Église Gnostique and other conflicts in and around the Kabbalistic Rose-Croix order. Tobias Churton's recent book, Occult Paris, is quite excellent. For the magical war around Boulan, Julian Baldick's biography of Huysmans has 2 awfully juicy chapters, and the best book on the Taxil hoax, which debunked it in print even before Jogan Paget's public admission, is Arthur Edward Waite's Devil Worship in France. Now, l'Église Gnostique had continued without Joannel and readmitted him when he returned, making him a bishop again in 1900. He wasn't the patriarch anymore. Now he was just Tau Jules instead of Tau Valentin. But in 1907, a new church was created by 3 bishops of l'Église Gnostique. The chief motivation seems to have come from Gerard Uncos, who was Tau Vincent. As the principal organizer of the Martinist order, he recognized a need among that membership for an occult church that would be more conventionally Catholic in its rites and symbols than was the Catharish Ecclesia Gnostica. Martinism was an expressly Christian esotericism with a strong orientation towards the Catholic sacraments, but the Catholic Church forbade Martinism and viewed it as basically a form of Freemasonry. So the idea was to create a church for the Martinist order, and they probably had Fabre Palapra's Templar Johannite Church as a model in this work. One of the other bishops involved was the Martinist Jean Bricaud, who was not only consecrated in l'Église Gnostique, but also held authorization from the Vintrasian Church and a Johannite succession from the primitive Christians. Their church, formed by these three bishops, was called l'Église Catholique Gnostique, with the Catholique to stress its appeal to esoterically minded Catholics. With the advent of l'Église Catholique Gnostique, the earlier Église Gnostique became known as l'Église Gnostique de France. In the summer of 1908, UNCOS organized an international Masonic and spiritualist conference held in Paris. In addition to the usual French suspects, this was attended by Theodore Royce, who was then actively organizing O.T.O. Royce admitted UNCOS to the sovereign sanctuary of the ninth degree and chartered him to operate a Masonic Supreme Grand Council, giving him in full effect, whether or not in title, the 10th degree of O.T.O. In return, UNCOS consecrated Royce a bishop of l'Église Catholique Gnostique and authorized him to serve as its chief authority in Germany. Less than a year later, the French bishops of l'Église Catholique Gnostique elected Jean Bricaud as their patriarch. Bricaud changed the name of the church to l'Église Gnostique Universelle, and Royce found himself the only bishop of l'Église Catholique Gnostique, and thus the effective patriarch of Die Gnostische Katholische Kirche, as he called it in German, and he synthesized this into O.T.O. Aleister Crowley affiliated with O.T.O. In 1910, entering at the 7th degree on the basis of his prior Masonic initiations. 2 years later, Royce recruited Crowley to head the order in England, and Crowley got right to work with that manifesto we mentioned earlier. He composed the Gnostic Mass, starting with the anthem, which is featured in The Ship, a Masonic mystery play dedicated to Royce and published in the 1913 Equinox number 10. This early period of authoring the Gnostic Catholic liturgy is also the one in which Crowley wrote the O.T.O. technical paper, Energized Enthusiasm, and just after the composition of Book 4, Part 2. Before the end of the decade, the ritual of the Gnostic Mass, as written by Crowley, had been published twice in English and once in Royce's German translation, always identified as a ceremony of O.T.O. The 1918 publications are generally taken as the official inception of E.G.C. because they included Royce's first public declaration of his authority as patriarch. So that makes our Gnostic Catholic Church just 104 years old. Some of us have been involved with it for a significant percentage of that time. Crowley succeeded Royce as head of O.T.O. in 1922, and thus as patriarch of E.G.C. Although he wrote of the Gnostic Mass as, quote, the central ceremony of the public and private celebration of O.T.O., we have no records of him ever serving as an officer in any public performance of an integral Gnostic Mass. In later correspondence with Wilfred Smith, then operating O.T.O. in the United States, Crowley mentioned having enacted bits of the Mass in ceremonies at the Abbey of Thelema in Cefalù. Smith, however, served as priest for the Gnostic Masses enacted by the Southern California Thelemites, who were chartered as Agape Lodge in 1935. Smith and his priestess, Regina Call, celebrated the Gnostic Mass every week for over a decade. Smith also incorporated the Church of Thelema in a good faith, but ultimately fruitless effort to institute a legal grounding for E.G.C. and other OTO organizational work in California. A parallel organizing tack was mounted by Crowley in the mid-1940s in correspondence with the English biology teacher, occultist, and wandering bishop W.B. Crow. I say parallel because the text of Crow's manifesto, which you can see on the right side of this slide, says that the Gnostic Mass is to begin, as if ignorant of the fact that it had most certainly already begun in America. And we see on the left, in this picture of Smith and Call, we see the Attic temple where they conducted masses. Nothing practical came of Crow's dialogue with Crowley. No clergy were ordained and no masses were celebrated, but we still have the manifesto. Karl Germer, whose magical name was Saturnus, was the Treasurer General of OTO at the time of Crowley's death in 1947. Although he was universally recognized as Crowley's successor by the membership of the order, he was more experienced with and focused on Crowley's AA order than he was OTO. He suspended OTO initiations, and there were then no active local groups of initiates to hold Gnostic masses, the sole exception being in Stein, Switzerland, where Hermann Metzger, who was in communication with Germer, did organize masses. Germer died in 1962 without naming a successor. On the left here is an image of the Swiss temple. After Germer's death, Metzger claimed to be his successor, but there was no ratification of this claim from outside Switzerland, and it was specifically denied by Frederick Mellinger, a ninth degree member whom Germer designated as executor of his estate and who had earlier been assigned to mentor Metzger. Eventually, Metzger developed his OTO group into something called the Ordo Illuminatorum, and they likely continued to use some form of liturgy derived from Crowley's Gnostic Mass pretty much up to the end of the 20th century. Germer had also extended authority to Kenneth Grant, Crowley's one-time secretary, to organize a local lodge in England. When Grant styled himself the head of a Grand Lodge or national section, Germer expelled him. But Grant went on to represent himself as the head of OTO for many years, including while he was writing the occult books for which he became famous. In those books, he often refers to rituals enacted by his New Isis Lodge, and these are generally variations on the theme of the Gnostic Mass, although they contain supernatural phenomena and bizarre monsters that are added for flavor. It's hard to know what to make of these. There's no evidence that he ever attempted to implement the actual canon of the Gnostic Mass. Also, in California, there was a group organized as the Solar Lodge, and this was run by a student of a ninth degree OTO initiate who had been a member of Agape Lodge. Through this channel, they had access to a wealth of published and confidential OTO material, and their membership largely believed them to be legitimately functioning as OTO. This group did, in fact, practice the Gnostic Mass on a regular basis. Grady McMurtry was a member of Agape Lodge who had received his ninth degree directly from Crowley, and also had letters from Crowley authorizing him to take control of the order in the event of a failure of leadership. He learned belatedly of Germer's death, and in 1969 he contacted other surviving initiates to advance his claims as the Caliph HYMENAEUS Alpha, and to begin reorganizing the order. The first Gnostic Mass of the reconstituted OTO was not held until 1977. In 1979, McMurtry incorporated E.G.C. as a nonprofit church body distinct from OTO. Grady then consecrated the first E.G.C. bishops outside the sovereign sanctuary. This practice touched off a thelemic vogue of wandering bishops. Members at the time believed, for reasons that seem murky now, that what Christians must consider to be irregular and defective episcopal consecrations would somehow make E.G.C. more legitimate in the eyes of the larger society. And a lot of effort was dedicated to researching and demonstrating apostolic succession for earlier E.G.C. leaders or acquiring it for current ones. Here you can see an assortment of E.G.C. related publications from the last few decades of the 20th century. The one on the right was published by the College of Thelema, but it's important, the one on the extreme left, this In the Continuum, is important because that issue contained an edition of Liber 15, the Canon of the Gnostic Mass, with extensive annotations by Sister Phyllis Seckler, who had been a member of Agape Lodge and was an important bridge from the practice of the Mass during Crowley's lifetime to the E.G.C. of the Caliphate. In 1985, after the death of Hymenaeus Alpha, there was an election among the ninth degree members in accordance with his stated wishes to determine his successor. That successor was the Bishop O.T.O. Silenus, now our current patriarch. This patriarch, Hymenaeus, also called Hymenaeus Beta, has made a number of important reforms to the E.G.C. rite. The first thing that he did was to dissolve the independent E.G.C. corporation so that the experiment of an E.G.C. hypothetically separate from O.T.O., but always with the same official head and massively overlapping membership, lasted only 6 years. The new O.T.O. bylaws in 1987 explicitly made the bishops into an ecclesiastical class of membership within O.T.O., and after evidence had accumulated for reckless ordinations and other dismal byproducts of the Episcopi Vagantes approach, HB suspended the consecration of bishops for a full year. Beginning in 1991, E.G.C. bishops have not been authorized to consecrate other bishops, as I said before. Only the Patriarch and the national primates have that authority, and there are now 5 such primates appointed beginning in 1996, with the last 2 appointed in 2014. Also, in 1991, HB implemented minimum degree requirements for E.G.C. ordination, so that deacons must be at least first degree in the MMM degree system of O.T.O., and thus initiated members of the order. Priests and priestesses must have received at least the first invitational degree of KEW, or Knight of the East and West, and bishops must have completed the entire Mysteria Mystica Maxima series of initiations through the 7th and final degree of that rite. So here's what some 21st century E.G.C. literature looks like. The 2 on the left are shown in their first editions, although more recent printings of each have gotten nicer looking. I think even the first editions are pretty classy compared to the products of the 80s and 90s. On the right, you can see a couple of my books, of course. Our U.S. primate is the National Grand Master SABAZIUS, who was consecrated a bishop as Tau Apirion. Within the United States Grand Lodge, the E.G.C. rite has been developed extensively since 1996. We now have a system of episcopal supervision for novices and clergy. We have approved rituals for various sacraments, administrative rules and guidelines to ensure quality work among clergy. National O.T.O. conferences in the United States have featured very large Gnostic masses. More than half of these have had the primate himself serving as priest. I once had the opportunity to serve as priest at a national conference Gnostic Mass. That was 2015 in Austin, and we had popular communion with 270 attendees. SABAZIUS has published his work, Mystery of Mystery, as an authoritative E.G.C. reference with historical, doctrinal, and liturgical contents. Most recently, in 2019, he has established the deacon sacerdotes as a new subclass of clergy, recognizing some deacons as possessing sacramental powers to administer sacraments of affiliation on a peer level with priests and priestesses, although not working in the priest or priestess roles of the Gnostic Mass. In other national sections of the order, E.G.C. has been developed differently. Here we see the distinct insignia of the Church for the United Kingdom on the left, Italy center, and the United States on the right. E.G.C. in Australia, for example, is organized very differently than it is in the US, and its sacraments are far more integrated into and identified with the MMM degree work. Now, in this brief talk, I've had to move quickly through some complicated topics. For those who want to research further on your own, I have a URL that I will supply by way of chat to give you a little bibliography. This document has some suggestions for readings in E.G.C. history. It's not exhaustive. It certainly doesn't cover all the things I've studied in order to put this talk together. but I hope you find it useful. With that, love is the law, love under will. Thank you very much for attending.